Tokyo, March 1945. Once the beating heart of an empire, now a city starving beneath a black sky. Every night, sirens wailed, and people rushed to shelters, clutching their children, praying the planes would pass. But on the evening of March 9th, no one knew that within hours, the city would cease to exist. For months, America had bombed Japan's factories, shipyards, and rail lines with disappointing results. Precision bombing had failed. The weather, the winds, and the clouds had protected Japan. So General Curtis LeMay decided that precision was a luxury. Fire would do what explosives could not. The mission was simple and terrifying. 279 B-29 Superfortresses would take off from bases in the Mariana Islands, loaded not with high explosives, but with something new, napalm, a weapon designed to burn everything it touched. Its creators called it improved incendiary gel. Its purpose was destruction on an unimaginable scale. In Tokyo, there were no more factories left to bomb. LeMay's orders were clear. The target was the city itself. Houses made of wood and paper, streets narrow as veins, over 1 million civilians asleep beneath the roofs that would soon ignite like dry leaves. That night, the first wave of B-29s crossed the dark Pacific. At 5,000 feet, half their usual altitude, they were invisible to radar and exposed to flak. The pilots could see the glow of the capital even before they arrived. At 12:08 a.m., the first bomb bays opened. Cylinders fell, spinning, scattering hundreds of smaller incendiaries over the eastern districts of Tokyo. The city lit up instantly. Within minutes, an ocean of flame replaced the night. People awoke to a roar unlike anything human. The air itself was on fire. As the napalm spread, temperatures reached 900 degrees Celsius. The oxygen was sucked out of the streets. Rivers boiled. Wooden houses exploded like lanterns. And the wind, a new, monstrous wind, began to blow. A firestorm, alive and growing, consuming everything. From above, pilots saw the fire rising higher than their planes. The smoke glowed red beneath them, twisting like a living thing. Radio communications broke down. They could hear only static, and the screams of Tokyo carried upward on the heat. For the Japanese civilians below, there was no escape. The canals overflowed with bodies. Mothers clutched children as the flames rolled across bridges and alleys. Firemen dropped their hoses and ran. The air burned inside lungs. Even the rivers became traps of boiling water. By sunrise, Tokyo was gone. 100,000 people were dead. 1 million were homeless. 40 square kilometers reduced to ash. And still, the planes kept coming. In Washington, officials called it Operation Meetinghouse, a technical success, a logistical triumph. But to those who were there both in the sky and on the ground, it was something else entirely. The birth of a new kind of war. The crews called them fire missions, but no one really understood what that meant, not until the first bombs fell. From the air, the city looked peaceful, just a black sea under a thin layer of clouds. Below, millions slept. Above, 279 B-29 Superfortresses flew in tight formation, silver shadows gliding through the night. Inside each plane, the men were young, tired, and afraid. They were not killers, just boys with maps, radios, and engines that shook the bones of heaven. They had been told this was strategic, that these bombs would shorten the war, that Tokyo's factories were hidden among its homes, and destroying them would cripple Japan's heart. Curtis LeMay's orders were clear. You will burn the city to the ground. He stripped the B-29s of guns to make them lighter. More bombs, less defense. The crews flew low, just 1,500 meters above the city, to make sure every incendiary landed. At 12:08 a.m., the first bomber opened its bay. Inside, clusters of M69 incendiaries were released, each containing a small cylinder filled with napalm gel. They fell silently, hundreds at a time, spinning through the cold air. When they hit the roofs, they burst into liquid fire, sticking to walls, to skin, to everything alive. From above, the pilots saw it, a line of glowing orange spreading like veins across the city, then another and another. Within minutes, Tokyo wasn't a city anymore. It was a storm. Flames jumped from house to house, merging into rivers of fire. The rising heat created its own wind, a vortex so strong it flipped vehicles, ripped trees from the ground, and dragged people into the inferno. The pilots felt it even miles above the turbulence from the heat lifting their planes. It looked, one said later, like the earth itself was burning. Inside the bombers, the heat rose even through the metal hull. Gunner windows cracked. Sweat rolled down faces that hadn't seen daylight in days. Radio operators called in targets, but their voices shook. Some cried silently. One navigator remembered watching the fire climb up into the sky and whispered, "My God, what have we done?" Tokyo's eastern wards were gone first. Shitamachi, Asakusa, Koto, entire neighborhoods vanished in minutes. The fire spread so fast that people had no time to run. The oxygen was consumed. Those who survived the flames suffocated in smoke. The rivers boiled, the asphalt melted. The noise, they said, was like a hurricane mixed with screams. Down below, civilians rushed to the canals. They believed the water would save them. It didn't. The surface caught fire as burning debris fell from the sky. Mothers pushed their children underwater, trying to protect them from the flames, not knowing the water was already near boiling. Some died clutching wet towels to their faces, believing they could breathe through them. From above, the B-29 pilots couldn't see individual people, only movement, flashes, chaos. The glow reached 30,000 feet into the air. It blinded them through their visors. The air smelled of burning oil, rubber, and flesh. One pilot radioed, "The whole damn city's a torch." Another whispered over the intercom, "Are we any better than the enemy?" No one answered. They just kept flying. Curtis LeMay's order had worked perfectly. In 6 hours, the raid had created the single deadliest night in human history. Over 100,000 people were killed, more than Hiroshima or Nagasaki. Over 1 million were left homeless. When the last bomber turned back toward the Marianas, the men were silent. Some vomited. Some stared at the instruments, refusing to look back. One gunner later wrote in his logbook, "We left hell behind us, and it followed us into our dreams." At the debriefing, LeMay listened to the reports with his usual calm. Mission successful. Losses minimal. 14 aircraft downed. 11 missing. Tokyo to 40% destroyed. He lit a cigar and said, "If we lose the war, I'll be tried as a war criminal." Then he exhaled and added, "But we won't lose." The headlines back home celebrated it as a triumph. Tokyo in flames, read the newspapers. U.S. airmen strike heart of Japan. But among the pilots, the victory felt hollow. They had done their job exactly as ordered, and yet something inside them had broken. They had seen what fire could do to a city built of paper, to a people who had nowhere left to run. In the following weeks, the raids continued. Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, 66 Japanese cities burned. And each time, the firestorm grew larger, the missions faster, the deaths easier to count. The crews stopped naming cities. They just called them targets. But for those who flew through that night, Tokyo was never just a target. It was the place where they learned what total war really meant, when killing no longer needed precision, only persistence. They had conquered the sky. But that night, they saw what it meant to rule from above and what it cost to be gods of fire. They woke to the sound of wind. Not the gentle wind of spring, but a deep, roaring breath that shook the walls and pulled at the doors. The sirens had become so common that many didn't run anymore. But that night felt different. The air was thick, hot, and the sky glowed red even before the bombs began to fall. In the narrow streets of eastern Tokyo, people lived shoulder to shoulder. Houses built from wood and paper, small gardens, bamboo fences, tatami mats that smelled of rice straw. When the first incendiary struck, the neighborhood lit like kindling. A woman named Harujo Nihei remembered running barefoot through the courtyard, hearing her father shout, "The whole city's burning." She turned back once and saw the roof explode into flame, a golden wave swallowing everything familiar. Children screamed. Mothers pulled futons over them, hoping to smother the fire. It didn't work. The heat melted the cloth to their skin. Pots of water boiled before they could be thrown. The sound, the deep, rumbling roar of oxygen feeding the inferno, drowned every hue and cry. Firestorms don't behave like normal fires. They breathe. They move like living things. The flames climbed 20 meters high, twisting in every direction. The air grew thin. People fell gasping on the ground, unable to breathe. Some tried to flee across bridges toward the river, but the fire chased them. Wooden bridges caught first, collapsing into the black water. Those who reached the canals jumped in, thinking the water would save them. It didn't. The fire consumed everything, including the air itself. It sucked the oxygen from the canals, boiled the surface, and sent waves of steam rolling through the smoke. One survivor later said, "The river looked alive, glowing red, and it was screaming." Children drowned, holding their parents. Families disappeared together, vanishing in the roar. In the confusion, the police and firefighters tried to hold order. But the hoses melted in their hands, and the water pressure died as pipes burst underground. One officer wrote later that the fire moved faster than any human could run. Those who stayed in their shelters suffocated. Those who fled were burned alive. The lucky ones, if that word still meant anything, found a few stone buildings or open parks where the flames couldn't reach. Even there, the heat was unbearable. Clothes burst into flame just from the air. A young boy named Katsumoto Sahoto, who would later write about that night, described how he and his family ran toward the Sumida River. "The fire followed us," he said. "The sky itself was burning. We heard the planes, and I thought they were laughing. From above, the bombers circled like ghosts, their silver bellies reflecting the fire beneath them. The pilots could see people running tiny shadows against the sea of light. One Japanese mother, unable to carry her baby through the smoke, left it by a shrine, whispering an apology before vanishing into the crowd. By 2 a.m., there was no difference between street and sky. Everything was fire. The heat created hurricane-force winds, pulling air toward the center of the blaze at over 160 kilometers an hour. Roof tiles flew like knives. Bodies lifted from the ground. The firestorm consumed not just a city, but sound itself. A wall of noise so constant it became silence. Somehow, a few survived. In the morning, they emerged from burned-out cellars, naked, blackened, unrecognizable. The smell of smoke and flesh hung over the ruins. The canals were full, not of water, but of ash and bodies. The streets were gone, landmarks erased. People wandered through the haze, calling names that would never be answered. Tokyo, once the largest city on earth, had become a skeleton of itself. 41 square kilometers turned to gray dust. For those who lived, the nightmare never ended. They buried their families in mass graves, or simply left them where they fell. They searched for food among the ruins, finding only melted iron, broken glass, and the black shapes of things that used to be homes. And above them, the contrails of the departing bombers stretched across the sky, silent white scars that faded into dawn. In Washington, officials calculated the results: 100,000 dead, 1 million homeless, 40% of the city destroyed. A success. But for the people below, it was something else entirely. The night when the sky turned against them. When the rain was fire, the rivers were steam, and the world ended not with an explosion, but with a whisper of flame. They called it Yaknohara, the field of burnt ashes, and for years, when the wind blew from the east, Tokyo still smelled of smoke. He was not the kind of man who smiled easily. His eyes were sharp, his voice low, his orders absolute. General Curtis Emerson LeMay, the architect of fire. To his men, he was both genius and machine. To history, he would become one of the most controversial figures ever to fly beneath a flag. Born in Columbus, Ohio, in 1906, LeMay was not raised for glory. He studied engineering, learned the language of machines before he learned the language of men. When he joined the Army Air Corps, he found his purpose in precision. His belief was simple. Wars are not won by emotion. They are won by efficiency. By 1945, that belief would set the world on fire. When LeMay took command of the 21 Bomber Command in the Pacific, morale was collapsing. The B-29 Superfortress, the most advanced bomber in history, was failing to achieve its goals. High-altitude missions over Japan were inaccurate, crippled by jet streams and clouds. The results were humiliating. Thousands of bombs dropped, and little to show for it. Factories still ran. Cities still lived. LeMay studied the data and saw a pattern. Japan's industry wasn't isolated in plants. It was embedded in homes, shops, and small workshops. The very neighborhoods were factories. Destroying them meant destroying Japan's ability to fight. Precision would no longer suffice. He issued a new order. Strip the B-29s of their guns, drop altitude to 5,000 feet, and load them with napalm. The crews were shocked. Flying that low meant suicide within range of anti-aircraft guns and night fighters. But LeMay didn't flinch. You can't fight a war safely, he told them. You win it or you lose it. There's nothing in between. He turned strategy into arithmetic. If each B-29 carried 6 tons of incendiaries and 279 planes flew the mission, the result would be over 1,600 tons of fire, enough to erase a city. The goal was not cruelty, it was calculation. He believed destroying Tokyo would break Japan's will faster than any invasion. To him, that meant fewer American deaths and a shorter war. But to the men who flew those missions, the logic felt colder than the sky. Pilots spoke of LeMay as the man who burned Japan. They followed orders, yet wondered where the line between victory and vengeance had vanished. LeMay didn't attend the missions. He stayed in the command center on Guam, smoking cigars, staring at maps lit by red lamps. Reports came in, target area completely destroyed. Losses minimal. He marked each one with a pen. No celebration, no remorse. Only progress. He once told a correspondent, "If we'd lost the war, I'd be tried as a war criminal." He said it without irony, because he believed it was true. But in his mind, that risk was the price of victory. You have to do what's necessary, he said, not what's nice. As the months passed, his campaign spread. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, 66 cities burned, each one reduced to ashes by the same formula. Low altitude, night raids, napalm clusters, and relentless precision. By July 1945, Japan's urban heart had collapsed. 40% of its cities were gone. 8.5 million people homeless. LeMay saw it as proof of concept. Others saw it as a descent into madness. President Truman would later call him the most efficient killer of the war. Historians would argue whether he saved lives or destroyed souls. To his pilots, he was something else, a man who demanded the impossible and somehow made them achieve it. After the war, he never apologized. When asked if he regretted Tokyo, he said, "War is cruel. The crueler it is, the sooner it's over." Yet even he admitted that something had changed in those months, not just in the enemy, but in America itself. The firebombings proved that industrial warfare had evolved beyond soldiers and battles. Cities were no longer targets, they were the battlefield. The night Tokyo burned, LeMay didn't see the flames. He saw data, numbers, results. But in those numbers lay the unspoken truth of modern war, that the line between strategy and slaughter had blurred forever. After 1945, LeMay would go on to lead the newly formed U.S. Air Force Strategic Command, building the doctrine of nuclear deterrence, massive retaliation, he called it. The logic was the same. Destroy enough cities, and no one will dare start another war. But deep down, he knew where that logic had begun. On a March night in 1945, when 279 planes flew over Tokyo, and the world learned how easily fire could replace humanity. He didn't believe in evil, he believed in victory, and that made him both necessary and terrifying. By the summer of 1945, Japan was no longer a nation. It was a shadow cast in smoke. City after city had vanished, erased not by invasion, but by fire from the sky. Osaka, Nagoya, Kobe, Yokohama, each one burned the same way Tokyo did. The maps in General LeMay's command room were dotted with red X's, marking destruction that no empire could survive. In the span of 4 months, 66 cities were bombed. The pattern was identical: low-altitude night raids, clusters of napalm, walls of flame moving faster than people could run. Every mission was efficient, impersonal, relentless. The pilots didn't know the names of the cities they destroyed. They just called them targets. For the people below, every night was the same nightmare. The sirens screamed, and there was nowhere left to hide. The shelters collapsed from heat. The rivers boiled again and again. By July, an estimated 8.5 million Japanese civilians were homeless. Entire families disappeared. Not buried, just gone. The empire that once dreamed of ruling Asia had been reduced to dust. Yet Japan's government refused to surrender. The military still preached the code of Bushido, that dying for the emperor was the highest honor. Surrender was unthinkable. Even as cities fell, soldiers trained children to fight with bamboo spears. The country was preparing to die. Meanwhile, in the Pacific Islands, the American bombers kept coming. The B-29s flew from Tinian, Saipan, and Guam, black silhouettes against the rising sun. Their engines were the sound of inevitability. They no longer needed to aim. The whole country was a target. On the ground, people began to lose their sense of time. Survivors wandered between ruins that no longer had names. In Tokyo, they called their burned neighborhoods Yaknohara, fields of ash. The air stank of wet charcoal and human remains. Food was gone. Clean water was rare. Hospitals overflowed with burned victims who had no medicine, no bandages, no hope. A priest named Shinjo Kageyama described the ruins as a land where even silence burns. He buried hundreds every day, marking the graves with stones because there were no coffins left. Mothers searched through ashes for the bones of their children, wrapping them in scraps of white cloth before collapsing beside them. Still, the bombers returned. On March 19th, Nagoya burned. On May 29th, Yokohama to 45% destroyed. On June 15th, Osaka 100,000 buildings gone in one night. By late July, Tokyo was bombed again. The city that had already died once was dying a second time. The sky belonged to America now. No Japanese plane dared rise to meet the bombers. Anti-aircraft fire was weak, desperate. The once proud Luftwaffe of the East, as Japan had called its own air force, was gone. What remained of its pilots were ghosts in training schools that had no fuel, no planes, no future. Inside Japan's war cabinet, chaos grew. Some generals urged surrender. Others demanded one final battle, a suicidal defense of the homeland. The emperor remained silent, praying for a miracle that would never come. And then, in July 1945, the U.S. dropped a new message, not in bombs, but in leaflets. They warned that every Japanese city would burn unless Japan surrendered unconditionally. Few believed it. They had already seen the worst. How could there be anything worse than this? But there was. In Washington, scientists from the Manhattan Project were preparing the next step, the atomic bomb. Yet among many strategists, including LeMay himself, there was a growing belief that the firebombing campaign had already achieved what the atom bomb would only confirm. Japan was finished, its people broken, its cities erased, its government cornered. Historians later argued that it was in Hiroshima that broke Japan's spirit. It was Tokyo, months earlier. The firebombings had already taught the nation that resistance was suicide. The atom bomb simply closed the wound. Still, even in ruin, Japan endured. In the ruins of Tokyo, children played with melted glass like marbles. Farmers rebuilt huts on the outskirts of destroyed cities. Women carried buckets of ashes from where their homes had been. A quiet strength replaced the screams. The American pilots flew home, believing they had ended the war. Some were proud, some were haunted. They had done their duty, as LeMay told them to, with precision, with fire, with no emotion. But at night, they dreamed of the same orange glow rising over Tokyo, the smell of napalm, the faint radio crackle of their own voices saying, "Mission complete." By August, Japan's empire lay in ruins. Its cities gone, its people starving, its emperor silent. All that remained were ashes. And in those ashes, the question no one could answer, was it victory or vengeance? By August 1945, Japan was a nation made of ruins. The cities were gone, the people exhausted, the empire broken but still breathing. The war should have been over, and yet it wasn't. From the ashes of fire came something even darker, something born not from the sky of bombers, but from the minds of scientists. It was called the atomic bomb. The United States had spent $2 billion in 3 years creating it, a weapon of unimaginable power, built in secret under the name the Manhattan Project. Few even knew it existed. Not even Curtis LeMay, who had burned 66 cities, had been told at first. His B-29s had proven what fire could do. But what was coming next would make fire look merciful. The order came from President Harry Truman. The target, Hiroshima, a city that had been spared the firebombings, specifically so the effects of this new weapon could be measured. At 8:15 a.m. on August 6, 1945, a single bomber, the Enola Gay, approached at 31,000 feet. Inside its belly rested a bomb called Little Boy. When the bomb bay opened, the crew felt nothing, just a faint thud, a drop, and silence. Then, 43 seconds later, a light brighter than the sun ripped through the sky. The shockwave flattened everything within a radius of 2 kilometers. The fireball reached 1 million degrees Celsius at its center. The air turned to plasma. Asphalt melted. People's shadows were burned into the walls behind them. The city vanished in 9 seconds. 80,000 dead instantly. Tens of thousands more burned alive in the hours that followed. From a distance, the pilots saw a column of smoke rising into the stratosphere, a swirling mushroom, gray and orange and alive. One crewman whispered, "My God, what have we done?" But the war didn't end. 3 days later, on August 9th, another B-29 boxcar flew toward Nagasaki. The city had been hidden by clouds. The target changed at the last moment. At 11:02 a.m., the bomb Fat Man detonated. Another fireball, another silence, another city gone. 70,000 more lives erased in seconds. The heat fused steel into glass. The rivers boiled again, as they had in Tokyo. But this time, there was no wind, no firestorm, just emptiness. The radiation crept outward like an invisible shadow. Survivors staggered through ruins that glowed. Their skin hung from their arms. Their eyes were gone. The ground itself shimmered with poison. In the following days, the Emperor of Japan broke his silence. In a trembling voice, he spoke to his people over the radio. We must endure the unendurable and accept surrender. It was the first time the Japanese people had ever heard his voice. On August 15, 1945, the war was over. From the White House to the streets of New York, the news exploded in celebration. Victory VJ Day, the end of World War II. But among those who had seen what victory looked like, celebration turned to silence. Curtis LeMay, now commanding the Strategic Air Forces, heard about Hiroshima and simply said, "We'd already destroyed every city in Japan." The atomic bomb had nothing to do with ending the war. He believed it because he had already witnessed what total destruction looked like. To him, the atom bomb was just a new kind of efficiency. But to the world, it was something else, a door that could never be closed again. Historians would debate forever whether the bombs were necessary. Some said they saved millions of lives that would have been lost in an invasion. Others said Japan was already finished, that fire had already done the work. But one truth was undeniable. The firebombings had prepared humanity for Hiroshima. After months of burning cities, the unthinkable had become routine. Tokyo had been the rehearsal. Hiroshima was the finale. When the American occupation began, the air smelled of ash and medicine. Journalists arrived expecting to see war. What they saw instead was silence, the silence of a civilization erased. In the ruins of Hiroshima, there were no screams left, only whispers. Survivors, burned and skeletal, spoke softly as if afraid the sky might hear them again. Doctors from the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey studied the effects on buildings, on cities, on human bodies. They took photographs, measured radiation, wrote reports in the language of science, not grief. They called it an unprecedented opportunity for research. The survivors called it something else, hell. And yet, in the ashes, life began again. A young girl in Hiroshima planted a single seed, a persimmon tree that somehow grew. In Nagasaki, priests rebuilt a shattered cathedral with their bare hands. And in Tokyo, the people who had already lived through fire began to rebuild their homes, stone by stone. The war had ended, but the age of fire had not. The sky had been conquered, not by gods, but by men. Men who had learned how to destroy the world from above and convinced themselves it was necessary. For centuries, humanity looked up at the heavens and saw hope. In 1945, they looked up and saw something else, the sky as a weapon. The world would never look at clouds the same way again. The war ended, but the fire never truly went out. It lived in the memories of those who survived, in the shadows of the cities that rose again, and in the silence that followed the victory songs. The ashes of 1945 settled into the soil of history. But beneath them, something kept burning. A question that no one could answer. Was it justice or vengeance? Japan rebuilt itself with trembling hands. In the ruins of Tokyo, children played among twisted rails and melted stone. Factories returned, trains ran again, and neon lights soon replaced the glow of napalm. But the old generation, those who had seen the fire, never forgot what it looked like when the sky itself became an enemy. Survivors described the same dream: the sound of wind, the smell of burning wood, and a horizon that glowed red forever. Katsumoto Saotome, who was 12 when Tokyo burned, spent his life telling the story of that night. He wrote, "We thought we had seen the end of the world, but the world simply went on without us." Others built museums, memorials, and peace parks, not to accuse, but to remember, because remembering was the only way to keep the fire from returning. In the United States, the war heroes returned home as victors. The newspapers called them the generation that saved the world, but for many pilots, the victory felt hollow. Some refused to talk about the missions. Others woke in the night, hearing the roar of the engines, smelling the smoke. They had followed orders, they had done their duty, but part of them had been left in the glow of the cities they burned. General Curtis LeMay became a legend, the man who defeated Japan from the air. He built the new U.S. Air Force, and later the Strategic Air Command, the guardians of America's nuclear arsenal. His philosophy never changed: deterrence through fear, peace through power. He believed the lesson of Tokyo was clear: wars must be ended quickly, brutally, and decisively. But in the quiet of old age, even he wondered if the fire had gone too far. The world entered a new era, the Cold War, built on the foundation laid by LeMay's doctrine. The same B-29 that dropped napalm on Tokyo became the ancestor of bombers that carried atomic weapons capable of ending humanity in minutes. The skies that once symbolized freedom now carried the constant threat of extinction. In the ruins of Hiroshima and Tokyo, a different idea was born, one that LeMay's logic could never erase. The survivors began to speak, slowly at first, then louder, to tell the world what it meant to be on the other side of progress. Their stories crossed borders, reaching scientists, generals, and children who would never see war but would inherit its memory. They built the Peace Dome in Hiroshima, leaving it as it was, half destroyed, half standing, a wound kept open so the world would remember. In Tokyo, memorial stones mark where the firestorm began, surrounded by skyscrapers of glass that reflect the same sky that once rained death. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey later admitted that Japan might have surrendered even without the atomic bombs. The fire raids had already destroyed 40% of its cities. The empire had simply run out of air to breathe. Yet, in the language of war, efficiency and necessity became the same word. The line between saving lives and ending them disappeared in the smoke. The men who made these decisions are gone now. LeMay, Truman, the scientists of Los Alamos, the pilots of the B-29s. But their legacy remains written in the clouds, invisible yet always above us. Every time a jet crosses the sky, every time a missile test lights the horizon, it carries the echo of that night in 1945, when human beings learned they could destroy the world without touching the ground. And so, the survivors teach. They bring their memories to classrooms, to museums, to documentaries like this one. They show photographs, blackened streets, twisted bicycles, shadows burned into concrete, not for pity, but for understanding. Because the danger isn't that humanity will forget what happened. The danger is that we will understand it too well and still choose to do it again. In 1945, the United States stood as the undisputed master of the skies. But history has no permanent victors. Power rises, power falls, and every empire built on fire eventually faces its reflection. The legacy of Meetinghouse isn't just destruction. It's the realization that progress without conscience leads only to smoke. As the sun rises over modern Tokyo, the city glitters like a miracle, millions of lives rebuilt from ashes. It's easy to forget what once happened here. But every year, on March 10th, the sirens sound again. Bells ring across the city at midnight. Survivors bow their heads. The silence is heavy, the air still. And if you stand in the right place, you can still feel it. A faint heat rising from the ground. A reminder that beneath the concrete and light, the earth remembers. The fire that once devoured a city has become a warning to the world. The sky, once a battlefield, now belongs to no one. But the question remains, whispered through history like smoke in the wind. If we ever faced that choice again, would we do it differently?